All right. If you are able to see us and hear us, then we've made it to Facebook Live. I feel like maybe I shouldn't start speaking until we're sure. All right. If you are streaming this on Facebook, welcome to the Land of the Free discussion. We are so excited to be hosting this discussion here at Made by Us. And I will share with you a little more about Made by Us, who we are, our very special guests today. And we're looking forward to a great discussion about freedom. What does it mean? How did we get here? And how is this playing out from a historical perspective all around us? So I just wanted to first welcome you all to the session. If you have questions as we're discussing, feel free to put them into the Facebook comments in the chat. And if you're just tuning in, let us know where you're listening from so we can say hello and see who we have here. We'll just get started in another minute while we're waiting for people to join. And if you're just tuning in, welcome to the Land of the Free discussion. One thing I will say while you're waiting for us to get started, a great activity to do to think about both our past, present, and future is to visit the website mywishforus.com. This is a program we've just launched. It's a website that invites you to share your vision for the future of the United States of America. So at Made by Us, we're all about using the past to look towards the future and to build a better future. So if you are so inclined, visit mywishforus.com, share your vision for the future, and then be sure to stay in touch with us so we can help you get there. So just some introductions. My name is Caroline Klibanoff. I am the program manager for Made by Us. We're an engine of dozens and dozens of history institutions and civic engagement organizations all across the United States. And our goal is to put history in the hands of young people as a tool for shaping the future. So if you're a millennial, if you're a Gen Z, Made by Us is the place for you to get your history and use it for civic participation. And we are so excited to have Kidada Williams here today. She is an internationally recognized expert on African Americans' lived experience of racist violence. She teaches courses at Wayne State University to some very lucky students, I'm sure. And she's done lots and lots of public history projects, including the Charleston syllabus. And I just have to call this out because it was one of the neatest things that I've seen. If you don't know, the Charleston syllabus was a crowdsourced project of all of these resources and documents and information and books to help put historical context around the 215 racial massacre at Charleston's Emmanuel AME Church. That awful event that catalyzed a lot of other events in this country is part of a long history, like everything else we're going to discuss today. And so being able to put the historical context around it is really valuable. And I just love that it was crowdsourced and brought together by so many voices. So I will now allow Kidada to introduce herself if there's anything else I left off. And I would love for you to share also with us about your upcoming podcast.
Okay. Thank you everyone for attending this event. And I want to thank the organizers for Made by Us and My Wish for Us. Let's see, I am, as Caroline said, Kidada Williams. I teach history and African-American history at Wayne State University in Detroit. I'm a historian. I'm an author of a book called They Left Great Marks on Me, and I'm in the process of finishing a book on African-Americans who were attacked by the Klan during Reconstruction. I'm the host of a forthcoming podcast called Seizing Freedom. It tells the story of African-Americans' agency during the Civil War and Reconstruction and how they extended more freedom to more Americans during that time period.
Excellent, thank you. We're so glad to have you here. We may also be joined by Ed Ayers. During this call, there was something else going on of utmost importance that we can't even reveal, but we'll be excited to share with you later on. He is a historian of the American South, a digital humanities and digital history pioneer, And he is also part of the Seizing Freedom podcast, and he has done backstory radio and really lots of digital media work. So if we're joined by Ed, great. In the meantime, we will get started with a discussion with myself and Kidada. And I wanted to also call out that we have this website, mywishforus.com, that captures wishes of the American people. There's also historical wishes on the site that you can look through and start to see what some figures in the past wished for. And Kidada, it's so great that you were able to share your wish with us too. And I'll just read this for you, and we'll also put it in the comments here. That we, the people, fulfill our historical obligations and responsibilities to build a more just world for all to enjoy and inhabit safely. I was so moved by this wish. It's a really powerful one. Thinking about, as we go into this discussion about history, about freedom, thinking about our historical obligations. What is our duty to each other and to our country, and to build a more just world for us to all inhabit safely. I think one of the issues that we're seeing play out right now is between freedom and safety. Issues like wearing a mask or going back to school really have that tension at their core. So we're going to dig in. These are not easy questions. So thank you, Kidada, for bearing with us and helping us understand the framing around all of these events. Let's go there. So I'm going to hand it to you. How has the definition of freedom changed throughout American history? Who has gotten to define that?
Well, the definition has changed significantly depending on who you're talking to or who you're talking about. Generally, the people in positions of power have been able to determine the boundaries of our freedom and who gets to enjoy them and who doesn't. So we've got the founding fathers who established the country with a commitment to declaring independence and fighting for freedom for what they saw as tyrannical government overreach. And so we get that with the Declaration of Independence. And they craft a constitution that is designed to protect, to create a government by the people, for the people, that will protect the freedoms of the people. And so, what we know is that the founders, they established freedoms and they made sure that their freedoms and rights were protected. But what we know is that there were large numbers of people who were also left out of that, because as they established freedom for themselves, they allowed chattel slavery to continue. They allowed the suppression of women, and so they have opportunities to gain access to this freedom. And so there were other people who were always on the outside of that circle looking in, who also believed that they too had a right to enjoy this freedom. And so what we've seen throughout US history is more of them taking decisive action to fight for, to seize freedom, to sort of crowd themselves into the circle of its protection. And when they have opportunities to sort of strike and make sure that that freedom is enjoyed by all. So you've got this really expansive definition that comes with the Declaration of Independence. And what people who have been locked outside of that have done is insist that these rights apply to everyone, not just certain people, not just wealthy people, not just, people who are male, but to everyone. And that's sort of been the sort of beauty of our democracy. It's, it's double-sided. You've got the freedoms for some, the denial of freedom, and specifically the enslavement of freedom, the enslavement of others, but a constant pressure upon the nation to sort of live up to its promises. And that's what African Americans were trying to do during the Civil War and even in the period before then and afterwards, which make the nation live up to the promises of the Declaration, the promises of the founding. So that definition of freedom hasn't remained constant. What we've done is we've added on to it, but we've added on to it as larger numbers of people have insisted on their right to enjoy it.
That's really interesting. I mean, it seems like you and I were discussing a little bit before this about mask mandates, and I've seen this messaging going around of we, not me. it's about the collective, it's not about the individual. And it seems like there's been some instances where freedom is something that one group can have by denying it to another. It almost elevates that freedom in a way. But other groups have said freedom, I'm not free until we're all free. Can you speak a little bit more about that, like the me versus we?
Sure. I think that what we know is that freedom doesn't have to, like everyone, freedom doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but people who want to hoard freedom often treat it that way. And so what we've had throughout sort of US history is people who would like to potentially hoard freedom for themselves, and people who have sort of pushed back against that and said, no, we can actually all enjoy this for our collective well-being. And African Americans in particular have always had a collective vision, a collective understanding of freedom. So not only were they forced outside of the circle of freedom by slavery, but even when they had opportunities to gain freedom for themselves, they never saw it as an individual thing. Freedom wasn't something that one could enjoy without one's people. Right? So you as an individual could be free, but if the rest of your family wasn't free, if other people in your community were not free, then how free were you really?
Right.
And so I think that, that there's a tension there, or there's a sort of broader vision of what freedom can be if we move beyond the sort of freedom for me, but not thee.
I that's such an important point, and I think about all of the people who fought for the right to vote, and it's not just marching in a collective mission to get the right to vote, but I think about people who lost their lives because they attempted to cast a vote. Actually, my father has a podcast about racially motivated killings of people in the Jim Crow South who had attempted to cast a vote and then unfortunately lost their life in that sacrifice. And it wasn't because they wanted to just cast one vote. We all know one vote makes a difference. Everyone should vote. But it's not, it was in service of a greater cause, of a greater movement. And I think that's so remarkable to keep in mind when we think about people fighting for freedom. It's not a given, even if it is in the Declaration.
Right. And I would even say that applies today to the pandemic, to the protests that we see happening in Portland, to climate. All of this is interconnected. Freedom isn't something that operates in a vacuum, that it applies to one area of life and not another. It's all interconnected. And so if we understand it in those terms, then I believe we can have a much more expansive vision. So the mask mandates are about protecting us all from the coronavirus. And if we are individually protected from the coronavirus, we are collectively protected from the coronavirus, and then we can enjoy all of the other freedoms within a larger society. We can socialize, we can, see our friends and family, we can go to school, we can go to church, we can do all of these things if we're willing to sort of work together for our collective well-being, not only for the short term, but the long term. So we need to survive the virus, but we also need to survive the sort of chaos that the virus has caused in all of our lives. And we can't do that alone. We can't sort of rely on only one group of people to sort of do that, to bear that responsibility. We all have an obligation. If we really believe in American freedom, we all have an obligation to do our part.
That's interesting. Freedom is an American value if we all uphold it. I think it's a Benjamin Franklin quote that said, a republic if you can keep it. So a question from Facebook: are mask wearing mandates a violation of American freedoms? And how does that backlash compare to other laws throughout history, seatbelts or vaccines?
Well, I would say, look, I don't think that I think that they are in the spirit of protecting American freedom. Because they're also, if again, we need to sort of think about a more expansive vision of freedom. If you are sick with the coronavirus, are you as free as you would be if you were healthy? Right? If members of your family are sick and experiencing the chronic illnesses that come with the coronavirus, the long-term illness that can come with some sufferers, is that individual and the people who have to care for them, are they as free as they would be if they had never gotten the virus.
Right.
And I think we need to sort of think about freedom is also about health.
Yeah.
And, you know, and also if you get sick with the coronavirus, are you as free if you are sick and you don't have access to adequate health care? Right? And so
Right.
again, it's all interconnected in ways that we often don't like to think about. So the mask mandate is to protect our freedom, but in a way that we may not be willing to acknowledge because we don't necessarily associate freedom with health.
And there's a timing issue. I mean, it's instant gratification. Is it freedom now or freedom later in the long term? And the different, you know, this day-to-day situation that we're in can vary. You're absolutely right. If you have coronavirus right now, you may not feel like you have freedom of mobility. You may not feel like even having freedom of mobility to go anywhere. But if you're protecting your long-term freedom later and those around you, that's really important.
And then there's also the economic component too, because, you know, your ability to earn a living is shaped by what happens. Many people's ability to earn a living is going to be shaped by what happens with what is happening and what will happen with the pandemic. So if it continues to spiral out of control for the United States, many of the sort of the economic freedoms that people think they enjoy, they won't be able to because they're going to be out of jobs.
It's interesting. And the other issue would be the school issue that's coming up right now. I mean, with all that we're dealing with, school closures, schools may be going online. Have public schools faced this tension before in history? I mean, have they imposed alternative learning scenarios? Have they temporarily closed? Because this is also an issue of maybe it's sacrifice now for the greater good later. Or maybe we can't sacrifice even one semester, and you know, there's implications for jobs and parents at home. So I'm just curious if there's any historical precedents we can look to here for insight.
I would say not necessarily with the pandemic or, you know, with a sort of public health issue. What we have seen is, you know, the number of schools that closed rather than desegregate in the 1950s and 60s. So what we see is that segregationists, they close the public schools in a number of Southern communities, Southern counties, and African Americans are shut out. They are completely denied access to any education. The white children, the vast majority of them are able to go to private parochial schools. And so we have seen, so I want to sort of underscore the fact that we have had a history where you've seen a group of people who have been completely excluded from education. So that has happened. We also have schools that are closing in cities and in rural areas across the country. So you've got the sort of undermining of education or the right to education that is an ongoing issue. What I think the coronavirus pandemic has done is expose the extent to which our communities and our country have been starving public education, have already been in the process of denying school kids throughout the United States the right to an education. And so I think that, so these are ongoing issues that I think that the pandemic has sort of magnified. And I don't know that the issue or that the solution, it seems like the solution can't be to expose students, parents, staff, and their families to a deadly virus.
Right.
You know, when there are other alternatives. I think the challenge with their alternatives is that they require a lot of time, energy, and money. And there are people who want to do this on the cheap.
Sure.
So, but what I think what we have is a moment where we can actually expand freedom, because if you believe education is related to freedom, as African Americans have always done, you know, if you sort of see that connection, maybe we could use this moment to re-envision education and provide for the needs of all of our children.
Right.
And to do it in a way where where we can address some of the disparities that have already existed and that are being magnified in the pandemic. I think the real answer is that parents and teachers, they have, and students themselves, we can't exclude them, they know what needs to be done.
Right.
They have ideas. What they haven't had is the support, financial and political, to do what they need to do in order to receive and provide an education safely.
That's right. Yeah, and you're so wise to point out how, the ways in which history can help us come up with creative solutions, because otherwise we're stuck in this opposing school, safety in the schools versus the right to an education. And that is sort of a false dichotomy, because we believe you should have both. Everyone should have the right to be safe and educated in this country. At least that's what we've said. So I think of one of our Made by Us partners is the Moton Museum in Farmville, Virginia, which does an amazing job putting the school closures during desegregation in context. And the work that was done there, if integrating those schools was not an option, if desegregation was not an option because of the political and social battles that had to be fought, or it would be unsafe, honestly, for African American children at that time, then, and the schools closed regardless, those students took matters into their own hands and did a lot of work to educate themselves. And it was this commitment to education in the face of not having an education. I mean, that's too big of a burden to bear. So I'm inspired by those instances. I wanted to bring in some questions from Facebook. We have one question. Do you think the founding fathers of the US understood freedom in narrow terms or in the broad terms of the founding documents? Did they believe what they established was for all or for a few? And so I know you addressed some of this, but if there's any other aspects there.
They believed it was for a few, right?
Right.
But they couldn't get all of those men to sign up to fight for independence if they just said we only mean certain men with property, with X amount of property. Because they were surrounded, there were many more men who had little to no property than there were men who were there were like the founding fathers. So they did have a really narrow vision. There was this idea that freedom would be that the same rights and privileges that they carved out would be enjoyed by other people later.
Interesting.
Right? But what we know is that they never really envisioned women enjoying those freedoms. They never really necessarily envisioned African Americans, people of African descent, and certainly not people of Native descent, enjoying those same rights, protections, and freedoms. At least not all of them. I think I should probably sort of, be clear on that. Not all of them. There were some who said, no, we really actually do believe the ideas of the Enlightenment and the spirit of the American Revolution. And we believe that everyone should be equal. So you've got, I think you've got both in the founding fathers, but in order to get the Constitution ratified, they do have to sort of be both specific and vague about what they mean in terms of freedom and who's able to enjoy it. But the beauty is that they give us a foundational document that Americans have gone back to time and time and time and time again. So even those who were shut out of the rights and privileges of freedom, like African Americans, even free Blacks before the Civil War, pushed and insisted on things like birthright citizenship.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to consider that, we're coming up on 250 years of that Declaration of Independence, and it has been up to the American people for 250 years to interpret it and make it so. I mean, it's just a document on paper. And I love what Eric Liu says in some of his civic sermons on this, in his book, his collection of civic sermons, about, we're one of these rare nations where this is all about what's on paper and ideals that we've put on paper, but it really is made by we the people. If we don't enact those, we're not a nation based on religion or a certain ethnicity, but in fact about ideals that someone wrote down 250 years ago. So I really do appreciate that. And someone in the comments, John has asked, land of the free is problematic to me. Do you agree that some are more free than others? And it sounds like what you're saying is there's a spectrum here.
I would say that there was a spectrum then, and there is a spectrum now. I think, going back to the statement about the founding documents, that they wrote it down, it's significant, it matters, because it gives people something to go back to. And African Americans, for example, have always said, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, we don't want anything new or special. We want what you put on paper.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And you said all men are created equal. If you had said white men, white men with property, we wouldn't have a claim. We wouldn't be able to sort of, we wouldn't have a stake in this. But that's not what you said.
Right.
That all men are created equal. And so what they do is they give us an imperfect document, but they give us something. I think they've given Americans something to work with to continue to go back to that sort of well and sort of build upon.
I love that. We had a wish come in through mywishforus.com that was, someone said, I wish for an America that matches the marketing material.
Yes.
So it's exactly what you're getting at there.
We all do, or a lot of us do.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of us like some of us like the idea. We care more about the ideal. We care more about the sort of, the symbols than we do about the reality.
That's a good point.
And, and sometimes the people who care more about the symbols than the reality are often the people who are trying to hoard freedom.
Right.
For themselves as individuals or specific groups, and not allow other people to enjoy them.
Right. It's unfortunate we're running out of time. I'll get to a couple more viewer questions because I'm realizing we didn't even have time to go into Confederate monuments, which is of course something you know a lot about and is Ed's specialty. And that's a real speaks to what you're just saying about symbols. Is this something really about heritage? Because if so, there's quite a rich heritage of US history that's not represented, that we could all be intent on representing more fully. So that's something to consider. But let me get to this question from a viewer. I believe the right to quality, equal education, and other rights are denied to many regarding socioeconomic status, home values, and much more. Do the speakers agree? Thoughts?
I would say yes. And that's to the point I made about education earlier. We've had situations where students have sued for the poor quality of their schools. They've sued because they've been denied the right to literacy, even within their schools. And so, we've got teachers who provide money out of their own paychecks in order to provide, the kids with the supplies they need. In a number of communities across the country, teachers can't even afford to buy their own homes. Right. And in some cases to even rent. And so that has a lot to do with inequality and the fact that we are actively in the process of denying people not only an access to an education, but access to a quality of life.
Right. I love those examples from history of students suing their schools or taking a stand. There's one of our partners now, Student Voice, is actively engaged in a campaign for more inclusive history education in their schools, believing that is a right as well. So there's lots of good work that's happening now, but it all is grounded in what has happened before, and the long fight for freedom. It's something that we seem to be talking about and across each other about constantly. So I think we have time for one more question. Your podcast coming up is called Seizing Freedom. What does it mean to seize freedom? I mean, it sounds empowering, but recognizing that could also be life or death in some cases, in the US as well as other countries. What does that tell us?
Well, one of the things that we know is that power is rarely conceded. So it's something that often has to, and that's the case for freedom, for American style freedom. It's not something that's conceded. It's often something that has to be taken. It has to be fought for, whether it's through putting one's body on the line in order to be able to vote, or fleeing a plantation where one was enslaved during the Civil War in order to make it to Union lines. And so the story of the podcast is about that very thing. African-American agency in claiming, seizing, taking freedom, because it's not something that's just going to be given to them automatically. And I think maybe that's it underscores the need to have many conversations about this so we can sort of tease out these details. But the podcast also gets into the issue of making freedom. So, I use this phrase, freedom taking and freedom making, because what African Americans are able to do during Reconstruction is use their sort of collective might to pressure, to hound, to harass members of Congress to actually extend more freedoms to more Americans. And so that's where we get the 14th, 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875. We don't get it because the nation thinks, oh, it's a wonderful thing to do, right? We get it because African Americans insist on it and they won't let it go. They say, no, you've said that freedom means all of these things. And we need this now put on paper because obviously you were lying before, right? Or you weren't being honest about what you were doing. So we need these documents to reflect the freedom that we've seen you all enjoy all of this time. And there was a moment when the nation was willing to do that. There was a lot of resistance to it. But the podcast sort of tells that story, that tension. African Americans need to take freedom, what they do with it, particularly expanding more freedoms to more Americans, because they don't fight for those rights only for themselves. Those rights are enjoyed by more Americans, you know, than had enjoyed them before. And so it's freedom making, freedom taking, and attention, because as they're taking freedom, power still doesn't just sort of give it, you know, it's not something that's given away. So there's resistance to it that's ongoing. And so that's the tension of the podcast. The story we'll be telling in the podcast.
I love that. I can't wait to check it out because, you know, freedom making, also what's fascinating about that, the African-American experience of taking freedom is that it makes freedom for others. I mean, we have seen that kind of clear the path for more freedom for people with disabilities or for women or people who have been denied freedom in other ways. So I think there's so many lessons.
The children of immigrants, the children of immigrants.
Absolutely.
Birthright citizenship comes from African Americans' insistence on it. Like they started arguing for birthright citizenship in the 1830s, right? But there's a moment connection. Exactly. So there's a moment during Reconstruction when they can take it and they can make it.
I love that. And it's continually learning from the past too. I mean, the struggle for freedom and for justice has been so long, but at each juncture, the current generation is learning from what has happened before across these different intersections of the many groups that are denied equal access to freedom. So,
and I'll just say quickly, that goes back to my wish.
Thank you.
About our obligation and responsibility. We, the people, live up to our obligation and responsibility to sort of make this freedom available for everyone to enjoy.
That is a beautiful sentiment to end on. Thank you. I hope we can work to make your wish come true. I share your wish. And I just want to say thank you to the brilliant Kidada Williams. We are so lucky to have her share her expertise with us here today. She is a professor. She teaches courses in African American history and American history at Wayne State University. She is an expert on African Americans' lived experiences of racist violence and many other subjects, clearly, as you've seen demonstrated today. And she is also the creator of the new podcast coming out with Ed Ayers, Seizing Freedom. So look for that. And thank you all for tuning in and for sharing your questions. Please be sure to share your wish for the future at mywishforus.com. As Kidada said, it is up to all of us to make it happen, to build the future, to build the next 250 years of the American project. So make sure your voice is heard and you're playing a part. Great. Thank you, Kidada.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.